particularly important, I think, for tonight's conversation to acknowledge the territories on which I live as a settler of color, as well as the water that's stolen from Shoal Lake 40 in Ontario, which is the water that we drink here in Winnipeg. Especially, it's important to acknowledge these ongoing settler colonial exploitations and violences in conversations of adoption, because we all know how the foster system as well as adoption systems are not just complicit in settler colonial as well as, you know, overseas colonial endeavors, but they're also weapons of those actions. So that is particularly on my mind as we discuss adoption amongst ourselves, mostly as settlers of color, I think, from what I can see on my Zoom screen. I'm so excited to be reading for you a little bit from this memoir, though it feels like I wrote it a long, long time ago. And so I'm thinking about adoption in different frameworks nowadays, I guess, through different perspectives, but I'm happy to read, and I'm glad that Leah brought up the idea of narrative and how it's so important to many of us to try to reclaim a sense of narrative and a sense of our own narrative, to have, as Mark Jung says, become subjects in our own discourse as opposed to objects in other people's discourses about adoption and kinship. And I wanted to share with you two moments that were actually quite difficult to write in this memoir because I felt the pressure of expectation, of reader expectation, in fact. And by that I mean, it seems to me that in a lot of adoption reunion stories or search stories or whatever, there is a narrative arc towards the reunion scene and a sort of another arc towards the explanation of what had happened. And so I wanted to read those two kind of medium length passages to you to maybe initiate this conversation, and hopefully in the questions we can talk some more about storytelling and story receiving. And so for those of you who've had a chance, and I appreciate you reading this book, you know that it's written in short vignettes, a fragmented structure, which was also deliberate. But I'll start with the vignette that sort of describes my reunion with my Korean mom and my sister. And this happened back in 2009 when I traveled to Seoul and met my mom and my younger sister at the agency. The day I again became an older sister has faded almost entirely from my memory. When I try to think back to that morning when my boyfriend, patient, worried, insistent, and I discovered the precision of the Seoul metro system when we arrived an hour early at the modest offices of the Social Welfare Society, I'm aware that some details have fallen away. But I remember the weight of my mother's arms around me. I remember her yellow chiffon shirt and nervous smile. I remember my sister's silence. I deduced Amma had taken an entire week off from work. Later, I wondered what she'd told her boss at the factory. What, if anything, she told her boyfriend at home. It happened early morning the day after we landed in Korea. The agency workers, they tried to choreograph the reunion, but it was unimaginable, unmanageable, uncontrollable. I was too early, which foiled their plans, so they sent my boyfriend and me away for a coffee, instructing us not to return for 30 minutes. I caught a glimpse of Amma and Bora, my younger sister, recognizing them from their photographs in an elevator as we were on our way to the cafe. Another social worker was frantically pushing the button to close the doors. The meeting had to happen as they'd planned, upstairs when everyone was ready. When everyone was watching. Later on, Bora would tell me how, in the moments leading up to the reunion, the agency workers spoke urgently to our mother and her about what they might expect from me when we finally met. Sadness, confusion, maybe even anger. Bora recounted the way Amma braced herself each time footsteps could be heard in the hallway, holding her breath, curling her hands into fists, pressing her fingernails into her palms. And then the noise the door made when it swung open and the agency worker triumphantly stepped into the room and I was pushed forward. I wasn't breathing. Amma rushed at me, her lost, then found daughter. She threw her arms around me and held on. The situation was uncomfortable. I stopped myself from blinking, from moving my eyes at all, because I was embarrassed and afraid I might start crying. And everyone was watching. Amma clung to me, but I didn't soften. Someone took my wrists in her hands and positioned my arms robotically around my mother's so that, to an onlooker, we appeared to be embracing. I heard the artificial snap of a digital camera capturing the staged tableau. My jaw started to hurt because I was clenching it so tight. I was holding everything inside because I was ashamed by how much I was feeling. Over the years, I'd learned how to harden my body around my emotions, to wait until it was safe to unfold. The situation was devastating. It's mortifying to know someone so deeply, but to be meeting them for the first time. Amma's hands were stroking my hair with the presumptuous intimacy a mother expects with her daughter. She moaned over and over again, "I'm sorry," in the language that had been ripped from my mouth before it had a chance to settle in. The agency worker offered me a tissue box, hinting that my lack of reaction was unappreciated. After all, so much planning had gone into this coming together. I ignored the tissues, but my boyfriend accepted some. He'd read all the translated letters and listened to my fears leading up to the reunion, and his eyes were appropriately wet. Everyone was crying except me. I was just there. And then the second passage that I wanted to read happens in Busan. I had invited my Korean mother to go to the Busan International Film Festival for the weekend with a professor that I was working with while I was in Korea. And then she had a grad student who also joined us. And this takes place, this is when my Korean mother finally tells me what had happened the day I was born. And it takes place about a month after I've arrived in Korea. The window of the fifth floor hotel room we'd rented for the weekend bowed towards the ocean, overlooking Hyundai Beach. It was mid-October, and there were 4 of us, the Korean professor, who was my connection at the college, one of her students, Amma, and me. We're in Busan for the annual International Film Festival. Mats of different colors were folded and piled to one side. Later that night, they'd be our beds. The wood floor was already starting to warm and the sea was angry, lunging against and over the straight barriers, surprising drivers as they tried to parallel park. It was 2 months since my time in Korea and dusk, so the ashes of 100 fireplaces swarmed the air and stuck to people's hair like flakes of dead skin. Without daylight savings, autumn in Korea meant extraordinary darkness. At the time, I didn't really consider the risk my mother took in coming on that weekend trip, but it must have been high. It was the second occasion we would sleep together the way mothers and daughters in Korea do. It had seemed like a good idea when, back in Seoul a few weeks earlier, the professor proposed the small vacation. When it was happening, though, I was bored by Korean conversation that kept me apart from the rest of the group. There was a bag of grapes, some cherry tomatoes, a cake, but I stayed to the side of the open room holding a dictionary to my chest, looking out the window. But then, unprompted, Amma told the story of my birth. When she started, it was to no one but the unfurnished room. Maybe she was overcome by the need to tell, knowing the professor could hear her, that the student could hear her, and together they could translate her words to me. Maybe it would be her only chance, our only chance. This is how our kinship has always needed to exist, through third parties. My mother told me about the day I was born, but we needed strangers to bear witness. I threw away your clothes. she said before anyone was paying much attention. The clothes I bought before you were born. Amma promised she had not been ashamed when I was growing inside her, even though my father was married, even though he already had one child, a son, still a baby. He promised we'd be a family instead. Him, Amma, me. They rented an apartment. I wondered who signed the lease, but I was afraid to ask. Now I wish I had. It makes a difference who signed it. She was in Seoul to work. She was sewing in a factory as she had continued to do for decades, as she was doing still when we had met earlier that year. Her family was in Gimcheon, hours away, worlds away. She was young. She loved him. He sang to her. His hair was thick with curls. His skin, like hers, was dark and rich. He was taller than most Korean men. He had freckles. He was from the city, and she couldn't believe he wanted to love her. And then she didn't believe he ever actually did. I was afraid to move. I was afraid she'd stop talking. At times I looked out the window, but it was pitch black, and I saw only our reflections mirrored back. I was holding my breath. She was holding my hand. Another baby came, my sister, on me, also with his wife. She must look like her mother because she doesn't look like her father. She doesn't look like me. He lived between homes, sometimes with his already born children, sometimes with my mother, and then, only a few months later, I arrived. It was early morning. She remembered that. Her parents were there. I was quiet. She'd been dreaming of persimmon and rock fruit during her pregnancy, so she knew I'd be a girl. She swore the room filled with the smell of iron and cinnamon when I emerged. My father was there. His parents were there. None of them looked at her. None of them looked at me. Panicked, because she remembered the stress of her pregnancy, my mother scanned me, counting every finger, every toe, rolling each one between her index finger and thumb. Then, in the hallway, my grandfather was talking to someone Oma didn't know. Then he was talking to his son, my father. Then he slapped his son, my father, across the face and walked away. Then my father walked away too. I couldn't breathe. The professor was crying as she translated Oma's words. The student was also crying. The stranger came into the birthing room. She had papers in her hand. Someone lifted me from Oma's arms. The stranger said something about a god Oma wouldn't know until decades later. Something about doing the right thing. Something about the future. The story slowed to a stop around there. The waves of tension and pain broke. There was nothing else to say. Exhaustion rushed in. But when it was done, Amma held on to me, awkward, because we were two grown women seated on the floor, so our legs got in the way. She held my hand still. She offered me her breast, something she'd not thought of or had the time for when she first bore me into the world. I declined, saddened. Most of what had been told didn't register in the moment. It would come back to me in memory later. Because early on, something my mother said triggered 3 words that repeated, blood pulse and thunder in my head, louder than my history and my mother's life secrets unfurling, spread out immodestly in front of strangers, louder than the still raging ocean, water breaking hard, then pressure, then pain that could split a woman in 2, then quiet awe at what had just happened. That night I cried in front of my mother at last. When she stopped speaking and the room vibrated, those 3 words fell from my mouth over and over. The only thing I'd say in response to her telling, you wanted me. Thanks.
Wow. That's beautiful, Danny. Yeah, I think as an adoptee, there are so many, there are lots of similarities that resonate for many of the stories that I've heard as well. So I wanted to just remind folks again, like if you have questions for Jenny, questions about the passages that you just heard, or about the memoir itself, you're certainly welcome to ask. There have been a couple that have been asked here, so I'll start with them. And then I also have some as well that I think would be interesting for folks to hear. So somebody had inquired, Jenny, how old were you on the day of meeting your birth family? And why were the social service people having such a staged meeting?
Yeah, okay. First of all, how dare you ask how old I am? Just kidding. I was 29 when I went to Korea for the first time and met my Korean family. I was 28 when I made first contact, so it was about 9 months between the time when I first was introduced by letter, I guess, to my Korean mom, and then when I met her face to face. And the second part of the question, maybe I missed it. Why was the adoption agency being so extra? Was that it, basically?
Yeah, that's a good synopsis. Yes.
Yeah. I feel that from my experiences when I was there, the agency workers are accustomed or anticipating big adoptee righteous emotions, which sometimes include anger and tension. And I feel that as a way to mitigate or circumvent some of what could be upsetting situations, things are extremely controlled, or they were in my case. Later on in the memoir, I recount meeting my Korean father, whom the agency, without my consent, gave my phone number and information to while I was living in Korea. And so I met him at the agency, and things did not go the same way. There was a lot of confrontation and a lot of upset. And in fact, the agency workers refused to translate what I was saying at that point. And so I feel that there's a lot of curation that happens, frankly, in those spaces. I think those of us who've had access to our files or have met other people, or even some of our biological kin in Korea, are well aware that narratives are being formulated and different tactics of control are happening over there.
Yeah, I think from like the adoption agencies in Korea have like a very different perspective for what a reunion should look like. And as Jenny said, there's a lot of curation that goes on, which I think as adoptees, like to have our lives be curated like perpetually is, a challenge I think that a lot of us are faced with, even when we go back to try and uncover, our truth and our origin story, which is interesting because I can't say that if you are not adopted, so the general population generally doesn't have a curated experience for very significant life events.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an interesting contrast.
It's like a spectacle almost, in ways. Like it feels like it's spectacular and to be watched.
Yeah, it's very like a performative experience in some sense, which is, I think, unusual is fair to say. I think for anybody. So I'll wait to see if other folks have questions. You're certainly welcome to ask. One thing that I wanted to see, I reread your book, Jenny, here, in case anybody hasn't seen it. It's here. This is the beautiful hardcover version, if you're interested.
For discounted price, you can get the paperback now.
For now, there's a paperback. Yeah, I think what's interesting as an adoptee, one of the places that we're often reminded that we are adopted, especially as adult adoptees, we navigate the world, generally don't have parents or siblings, which can be the hallmark for us, which signifies our difference when we're, children or youth with our families. But as adults, we navigate the world because as adoptees, we grow up. But one of the areas and places in our lives that we're perpetually reminded is anywhere within like the medical system. So if you go for a doctor's appointment, they ask about your family history. If you go to your dentist or chiropractor or physio, wherever. And so I thought this was really interesting as far as, well, in the section when you said, knowing as far as your father, well, this is a spoiler for anybody who hasn't read it, but your father, how he had stomach cancer. So how now, the cancer ate at your grandfather's stomach, and it took your mom's uterus, killing your father. as far as knowing what that reality is as far as your birth history, for your medical history, and before you described it as the unknowing was in some ways liberating. Can you maybe talk about like that tension as far as, you know, I think a lot of adoptees, there's this belief that there'll be like this immense relief in finding out what our unknown history is. But instead, as a contrast, you found it as like, you know, as a burden in some ways. I think it'd be interesting as far as like to share what that contrast was for you.
Sure, yeah. You're the first person who's ever asked me about that section.
Sure.
It takes an adoptee moderator to like to pick up on these threads. You know, of course, it can be extremely upsetting and like not embarrassing, but just like unnecessarily revealing when one has to fill out all of those forms every time you switch a doctor. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's like stayed with a doctor that they're not that keen about, just so that they don't have to go through that process again of the extra tests. At least in my experience has been more medical tests, or alternatively, then the doctor is saying, well, it doesn't really matter that much anyways, which then makes you feel like this moment of feeling lost was for nothing if it doesn't really matter that much to begin with. But you're right, the strange contradiction of, or the strange conundrum of that whole situation is that, of course, doctors ask for that information because they're looking for congenital problems, right? Like not positive things. They're not asking for medical history of like awesome 20/20 vision or like a lack of male pattern baldness in your genes or anything like that. They're like asking for things to circumvent medical challenges, right? Or to have that information. So on the one hand, it's like, I wish I had that information. I wish I didn't have to reveal this part of myself every time. I wish I just knew these things. But then on the other hand, when you do have that information, I mean, understanding that a lot of things are also social and behavioral, and like there are other aspects that go into different wellness concerns. But when you have that information, for me, it just felt like having small seeds of that, knowing like this person perished from this person perished from that, but then not having anything else. So it became even more upsetting, and all of a sudden having to think, oh, well, you know, maybe I shouldn't eat that, or maybe I shouldn't be doing this particular behavioral thing because now I do have that information. You know, it's kind of a weird paradox.
Yeah. No, I think that, you know, they say ignorance is bliss for a reason, right? Even though that can come with its own, you know, questions and uncertainties as well. But
it'd be nice if it could be like not ignorance, but also with the typical supports that people have in their lives.
Yeah.
To work through the knowledge, because it feels like getting like the crap part of it
Yeah.
without also having the gentleness, people to talk through those experiences. It still feels alone, but just differently alone.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point, because I feel like as adult adoptees, we're given like these snippets of whatever our lives may be, right? Even post reunion, right? There's like a snippet of, oh, this is part of your family history, but it's in such isolation in the way that when you are not adopted, you have like all this additional context about whatever, whether it is a medical condition, right? Like the medical journey to get to whatever endpoint, whether recovery or something else, or even, you know, like the immigration story or following the Korean War, right? There are like these very significant events that have happened within a life that you have the benefit of having the additional context when you are not an adoptee. But as an adoptee, it's just like this bomb that's exploded in isolation, and then you're just left waiting. So I think that's a great point, Jenny. So we have some additional questions here. Jenny, after your journey to Korea and meeting your biological mother and sister, how did you reflect on the reunion? Did you feel more emotional afterwards?
That's a really helpful question for me because, as you know, I was quite wooden or quite uncomfortable in the moment. Um, I've only been able to reflect on a lot of these things many years after the reunion happened because shortly after I returned to Canada, I stayed in Korea for several months, but when I returned to Canada, um, I was like back to work immediately. And another part of my memoir is that my Korean sister like moved to Montreal where I was living and now lives in Winnipeg actually. So I was maintaining those relationships and my Korean family came to Canada to visit. So it never felt like there was a time immediately thereafter to actually think about what had happened. Now, when I did finally have a moment, I'd gone on research leave from my job um, and was trying to do academic writing. And that's when this memoir came out. So that was kind of the act of reflection, was through the process of writing. Then again, also people always ask, was it super cathartic? Like, was it therapeutic to write it and whatnot? And for me, it wasn't. But what became quite emotional and reflective was reading back the passages after the fact, because it feels like you actually exist then, and that the things that had happened to you, maybe it's because I'm like a literary studies scholar, like I just um, think of the world through text and writing. It really, that was the most emotional part for me. And I cannot read that second passage that I read to you folks tonight. I cannot read that without like having a bit of a like a flinch in it. That's one of three things that I struggle to read back about myself in those moments. And it's the only one I ever do for readings. The other two I don't even touch with the 10 people. So so the process is still ongoing, in other words.
Well, thank you for sharing with us, Jenny.
Sorry.
No, I was just like, thank you so much for having the courage to share those passages with us.
No, I mean, I always forget also that it triggers me until I'm like reading it and I'm like, oh no, like how can I change this reading? Like, will they notice if like I just skip ahead? But yeah.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. Well, another question was actually you referenced it as far as kind of your academic work and maybe how it has impacted your writing. So somebody asked, I was really interested in what you said about how you structured your memoir, with the reunion taking place near the beginning and not the end of the book, as in many reunion narratives. I was wondering if you could talk about that decision a bit more. Oh, this is a big question. And about, oh, maybe not. If you could talk about that decision a bit more and about why you chose to write your book in small fragments instead of long form chapters.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I thought about this a lot, so I love when I'm asked this question. So my research before this book was about Asian adoption narrative, not just memoir, all kinds of storytelling. And you're right, I like the majority of texts follow the narrative arc, or however you want to call it, of the reunion or the return trip, at least being like the apex. If you imagine, like, is this the right direction for you folks? I don't know.
Yep.
The apex of like the narrative arc, that reunion or that return is at the top of it. And then there's kind of the aftermath that happens. I knew, having read so many of those texts that are remarkable and so meaningful, that that I wanted to say something a little bit different. And I felt, having read all of those other texts, that the thing that I could do differently would be to start with the reunion and like feather out from there. Because it's quite, I think, unique and remarkable to have a long relationship with first family or biological family after reunion. And to be writing or thinking about writing so long after that's happened. So there are all these years of what's happened since. I always say to people, I wanted to write like the next day after Darcy and Elizabeth get married at the end of Pride and Prejudice. And then like they're like, oh yeah, we're fine now. But you know there's going to be like shenanigans happening like in the years to come. Like it is not going to be as smooth sailing or whatever. And I wanted to write about that. In terms of the fragmented structure, it started out as poems, this book, in fact, and was transformed into different genre. So that in part speaks, I think, to the smaller snapshots of ideas. But I also knew, you know, the idea of memory work or memoir, like, is not an opportunity for everyone in society equally. And by that, I mean, some of us, some of you are piecing together like a sense of identity and subjectivity through like these little scraps or these little quilt pieces or whatever metaphor you want to use, these little shards of information. And so not only do these core elements of what are supposed to be our memories come to us in broken pieces, but for me, memory, especially around adoption stuff, which feels quite traumatized at times, also comes back in a shattered way. It's impossible for me to think of some of the things that I'd experienced over there and over here related to adoption in a linear way. And so I just felt that it was a more genuine expression of the way my mind is thinking about these things. And then B, I just felt also it would be a way to innovate the subgenre of adoption storytelling. And so that's why it came out like that. The other reason I think it's important for me to articulate why I wanted to begin with the reunion was because I was very deliberate about not writing a story that was mostly about white people. In this case, I wanted to write a story that was about Korean women specifically, and I wanted to decenter adoptive parents and experience in the adopted home and focus on something else, because there were all those other stories that people can read of people who had similar experiences to mine. So I didn't want to be sort of repetitive and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that certainly your memoir really stood out for that reason. I've read a lot of many different
Probably more than me, actually.
Yeah, and I feel that the way that you were able to kind of structurally create that experience as far as being fragmented, being displaced, and then stitching together different pieces was really beautiful. This is another question about your writing. So at which point in your life did you think you wanted to pursue writing? Has this book been the culmination of all your writing about adoption or about your adoption? i.e., did you do a lot of shorter pieces about adoption? I feel like you've kind of mentioned this originally started off as poetry, but yeah, if you can maybe expand upon that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. This is really my first attempt at creative writing. I had a couple of poems I published in Rice Paper like back in 2014, 2015. But my writing before this was academic in nature, which, like, no shade, but like this is so much easier and like so much more interesting for me, at least. And so I didn't have any familiarity writing. That said, as I mentioned, my scholarly writing was about adoption, and I had a book that came out in 2020 that was called Adoption and Multiculturalism. That's an academic book, but I don't recommend it. It's like very expensive. Like, you know, these scholarly presses, they're very exploitative, I think. They're very expensive, but that was the kind of writing that I was doing. And coming to creative writing through this particular lens It really does feel like a homecoming because it just feels so natural and good. I felt that academic writing for me was always such a chore, and I was always procrastinating, and I was always so insecure about it. I felt that I was an imposter. I felt that I was always imitating this and that. Um, and with this kind of writing, um, it feels like comfortable in my mouth, if that makes sense. Um, and it feels like the kind of words and the ways one thinks about words in creative writing that's different in academic writing. It's like more my gig. It's like it's more comfortable for me, and it's more comfortable for these subjects too, because frankly, like I work in race studies, and the ways that much of academic discourse about race studies sort of excludes and precludes like the very subjects of the conversation from being a part of the conversation. I was like, that's pretty dodgy, I think.
So we have, I think that's interesting because my sense is that within academic writing, it's very constrained, right? Just like reading any journal article. But obviously in this format, you're able to really be able to kind of explore and express yourself in ways that are more creative and use a lot of different tools as far as really capturing different moments. So I think that certainly makes sense and why it feels more comfortable to like wear that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to discount also like the kind of thoughtfulness that like creative writers put into their writing, the kind of research that they do. It just feels it's just presented differently. And so by that I mean like in the memoir as well as in the novels I'm writing right now, they're like very research heavy, but unlike in academic writing or the kind of academic writing I was doing, um, I feel like equally as important to telling people what you know is like holding back, like having sort of a more subtle, sort of implied kind of communication. And perhaps this is why, from my experience as an adoptee, this feels more comfortable because scholarly writing is all about like, well, look what I can do. Look how like outstanding I am. This is all the stuff I've done before. And so now I can prove like blah, 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 right? But I know when I was growing up in my white family, I felt very self-conscious and didn't want like all of that attention in those particular ways all of the time, or didn't want people to be looking at me in those particular ways. And I feel that in creative writing, there are ways to, while still being quite public, still being seen, like have more control over like what you're holding back. Little bit. There's just a different way to communicate and to exist in plain sight, but also with the feeling of more self-preservation, not to show all your cards, in other words.
Yeah. And this is a total shifting gears for this next question. It's more around kind of the structure as far as the system, we'll say, of international adoption. So do you think that the social service personnel had an obligation to report to any media? Is it maybe a way of protecting Korea from international criticism?
Okay. Can that be rephrased?
Yeah, I'm a little actually uncertain as far as reporting like a specific event or incident. I don't know, maybe the person who wrote that can add some additional clarity in the text. And maybe while they do that, we'll ask them the next
Sorry, it's totally my bad. Honestly, it's like late in the day here, so
no, not at all. Yeah, not at all. So, well, if the person, if they would like to add some additional clarity, because I'm actually uncertain as well as far as reporting whatever statistics or about a specific reunion. So you're certainly welcome to add additional context. And then as far as another question, which is always the time travel question that people like to ask. So if there was one thing you could go back and tell yourself prior to meeting your birth mother, what would it be?
I think that our relationship could have flourished more or been fairer for all of us if, how can I say? If I'd realized back then that even in reunion, it wasn't going to solve anything, that it would just be different questions and different yearnings. The main thing that I think I wanted my Korean family to solve for me were feelings of racial isolation. And given how homogenous Korea is, they had no capacity to even understand what I meant when I said I felt racially isolated. So the conversations I wanted to have about feeling alone or not belonging or racism, foolishly in my head before, I thought, well, when I meet these people, everything's going to like come together. Like the pieces are going to come together and it'll feel safe. But that was an unfair assumption because they didn't have the tools, just like I didn't, but for a different reason, to have those conversations and to help me think through those things. So that's, I guess, like the main thing that I take away from that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really, for a lot of adoptees, there's, which actually, goes to the structure of a lot of memoirs, in the sense that the reunion is often structured and framed as like the highlight, like the end point and like final destination. Yeah. And for any adoptee who has, honestly been so fortunate, I know I think the stats within China and what the reunion rates will be like in the coming years will be really interesting if they are reflective and mirror what Korea historically has been. So Korea as a country has really been historically, a leader as far as the number of international adoptions and the kind of the infrastructure that has been set forth. So some stats say there's, less than 5% of Korean adoptees reunite. Maybe with DNA tests and everything else that might change. And then of the adoptees, of that 5%, maybe less than 2% of that 5% actually have get to meet and have like an ongoing relationship. So within that, it's a very small sample, but there's always this assumption that, the end goal of meeting your family or doing your reunion is like the final destination. But the reality is that with that comes all these additional questions and complexities, which are, which Jenny really beautifully chronicles in her book, because it really is just the beginning of an entirely new narrative and a new experience that is, to be honest, in and of itself, also such a unique and minority experience already within the adoptee community. So I think there are a lot of similarities within Asian adoptees as a whole. For those of us who have been able to return back to our homeland and do a birth search, but for those who have reunited, it is such a small minority community, even within the adoptee community as a whole. So I think there's I think that's a really good point to highlight, in the sense that it is one point within our experience and journey as an adoptee. So yeah, as far as, we wanted to, we're getting close to the top of the hour here. There wasn't, if we have time, so that maybe we'll, Jenny, if you don't mind, there's one more quick question that we had asked.
Maybe if I can like try to circle back to the other question, and I'll like in a flawed way, I'm sure, and insufficiently try to speak to it. what I take from the question, I guess, is what responsibilities does the Korean government, do all governments have to first families, to adoptees, etc. And what responsibility do agencies have to these people as the facilitators of these wishes? More than what have been exhibited, I think. I have to admit, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so I have a hard time keeping up with like current sort of shifts in regulations and policy and practice, but I highly doubt that this practice will continue to the end of my life, hopefully, with the assumption that I live to old age. I highly doubt that. So I'll just leave that at that.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how international adoption continues to evolve, and I think that's fair to say. So somebody wrote, thank you so much. This is a nice way to end. Thank you so much for your beautiful writing, Jenny. Being the first and largest piece of non-academic writing, how would you describe your experience reading your story at book readings? For example, has it been exposing or a safe place within your comfort zone?
Yeah, thanks. It's a question, we were sort of talking about this before the event started, actually. Public events are becoming kind of a public adoptee, whatever that means. It's so different from academic writing, where no shade, unless you're like some superstar brainiac celebrity, it's like 10 people are going to read your article, and probably not all the way through, I'm not going to lie. So it's extremely different from that. So beyond that, it's also the goal of publishing in mainstream trade is for empathetic readers who have no idea about the subject matter to come to your writing. So it's about finding a balance between teaching. No one wants to become like a native informant or like that weird position of like autoethnographer. So finding a way to be informative without being condescending or didactic or like always teaching with that weird kind of tone. And so it's been a curious transition in my career. Now my university expects me only to do creative writing, which is exciting for me, but is not something that I have any formal training in. A friend of mine who's also a memoirist and novelist too was saying recently online, you know, in MFA, they should teach you how to deal with like publicity tours, how to manage the media, which has been a total trip, let me tell you, how to have expectations in book clubs, how to communicate what your needs are in those spaces, I guess, how to deal with stalkers, which is a frequent reality, I think, of this world. I think I've been navigating, because my book came out in September before COVID, and then, so I had like half of a book tour before everything sort of, people stopped traveling and stuff like that. I feel like it's a different experience. I was able to have some of like the fun stuff of book tour, like all the parties and like snacks and stuff and getting to meet people face to face. But on the other hand, I feel like I've missed out on some pieces of it. My US tour was canceled completely. So yeah, I don't know. I think navigating things like that as best I can, trying to find online ways to like make connections with like good people like you folks, like being so kind as to welcome me. The questions like can be wild. at like literary festivals and at readings. Even at my own book launch, there were like some shenanigans happening at the first launch. So it's launched first in Toronto, as Leah knows. There were some shenanigans going on there, but one becomes more adept at navigating those things as you go on. I was telling to Leah, a colleague of mine, another writer, she's a poet, and I are putting together a book that is adoptees interviewing one another, public adoptees interviewing one another about Q&A sessions. So it's going to be like not just writers, but also artists, activists, like influencers, etc. Like all the people who, for different reasons, are in the public eye, and thinking through how audiences respond. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's being hyper visible or being the subject of people watching you from youth is uncomfortable. So what in anyone's mind makes them choose to become public more so later on? So we want to think through those kinds of things and what kind of fun stuff comes out of those conversations, but also what kind of complicated feeling things can come out. If y'all have read Lee Markel's book Conversations with Canadians, it's inspired by that. She's this badass Indigenous writer who like basically published a book about the shady things like white settlers mostly ask her at readings. So we're inspired by that.
Yeah, I think the forum, the moderator, the facilitator, and audience really do a lot to shape the kind of dialogue that happens, which is very much the reason why, you know, the HeiJun Adoptees and any organization that is really led by adoptees that have that lens is, I think, really important, because we have a very different perspective to share and questions to ask, right? I mean, you mentioned, as far as my question around your medical records and your history, it's how many tours and how many conversations have you had, and for that to be the first time for you to have been asked. Whereas I think as an adoptee, it's something that certainly stood out to myself, and I think to a lot of others as well within the community. Before we go,
every time I do an adoptee, like moderated or adoptee centered event, 0 people ask me how my Canadian family react to the memoir. But every time that I do like a non-adoptee centered event, that's always one of the questions. And I'm like, are you people tripping? Like they're on like 2 pages of this memoir. Like no one has ever asked me how my Korean family feels about this memoir.
yeah,
So, like that, like those kinds of things are so noticeable between spaces, you know? Yeah.
And that really does highlight, right? Like we talk about the adoption triad and all the different participants in it, but the birth family, as far as being an incredibly important part of that triad, so rarely has a voice or a space or pages within a book. And I think that's really important to highlight as well. So we do have one last question. That's probably one of the most important ones. But before we do that, I'm going to do a cliffhanger. So we've been asked by, we'd ask if folks would be open to having being a part of a photo. You know, it'll be like one of those Zoom photos that some people hate, some people love. You can pick. So you can choose now if you want to keep your camera on or off. You're across a couple of pages. So I'll do a screenshot across the 2 pages. But I do want to warn you, so you can turn your camera on if you'd like to be a part of the photo. I'll do a couple for both the pages, and then I'll do some Photoshop magic to put everybody together who's on. And then if you have your camera off, don't worry, you will not appear. Like it won't just be your name. I'll make sure that you're
like a 1, 2, 3, unlike before event started. I was like eating or something in the phone.
Okay, well, I'll do this. I'll even do like a gesture. Okay, ready? So we'll do 1. Wait, we'll do. Oh, Rob, I love it. The heart. Okay, we'll do 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's 1 page, and then I'm just gonna do the second page here. We'll do 1, 2, 3. Great. Okay, and so the last question, which is the most important question, is this available is the book available to buy online? And they wrote, thank you very much to Dr. Jenny and to myself for facilitating. And I wanted to say that, yes, this book is definitely available online. Jenny has encouraged everybody to try, and if you can, to support your local bookstore. I do not know all the local bookstores across Canada, but I'm sure that you do. So if you can, try to support local. There's certainly a lot on Queen Street in Toronto. But you can. If not, then definitely Amazon. It's available both on audio and in print. So both the hard copy and the soft copy, which has just recently been printed and released, as well as for audio, if that is your preferred means of consumption. Oh, yeah. So with that, I mean, Jenny, I would love to hear if you have any last or parting words for folks.
No, I'm so excited. Thank you so much. If you're in Vancouver, Massey Books. If you're in Toronto, Another Story. If you're in Winnipeg or in the prairies, McNally Robinson are just some of the awesome independent and BIPOC centered and BIPOC led, in many cases, bookstores that do a lot, I think, for folks. But thank you so much for hosting me. I hope it wasn't super boring or super weird. I feel like this time of the evening in such a snowy climb, it's hard for me to keep focus. So, but I appreciate you all being here, and read other BIPOC writers, read other adoptee writers, support queer and trans writers of color. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. It was truly a treat for all of us to be able to hear from you. I feel honored to have been your friend for so long, and I'm really so incredibly proud of you to have published. It's such a beautiful book, and it's such an important piece to have part of the adoption narrative. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody.
Adoption novels coming out soon.
Thank you for everybody for coming and your support. We'd love to welcome you again. Feel free to follow us on our Facebook page, the HeiJun Adoptees of Canada. That's the best place as far as keeping up with our coming events. We have some great programming that we'll do later this year, also likely via Zoom. And yeah, thank you for everybody. Feel free to reach out via Facebook, etc. I think I'm connected with many people on lots of different channels. So however you initially reached out to me, I'm still there. And with that, I hope that everybody has a lovely evening. And it was a pleasure to see everybody tonight. Bye, folks.
Thank you so much.